Hello, everyone. This is the Deaf Journey series, and today, September 19th, 2022. This morning, we have a special guest that I'm going to be interviewing. Her name is Peggy Mathis. Welcome, Peggy.
Hello. Yes, I am Peggy Mathis, and I am from Mount Juliet, Tennessee.
Do you remember how we first met?
Yes, I remember meeting you when we were at a deaf night out. And we were at a restaurant eating, and I was very interested that you worked in the library and that you were from Michigan, and we just hit it off from there.
Okay, that's wonderful. So now, in this series, it takes place once a month, and I host a variety of different people and interview them about their experiences growing up, their work experiences, their general life experiences, all different kinds of things. So I have some questions for you about your family and your hearing loss. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
My parents can both hear, but I do have one brother who is deaf. He unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. But it was nice to grow up with my brother who was also deaf. We were able to communicate with each other, and we helped each other out.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about your brother. I know he was very special to you. His name was Lloyd?
Right, Lloyd. Yes, his name was Lloyd. He was a wonderful man.
Yes, he was. Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I just have the one brother, Lloyd. But I do have a long line of cousins who are deaf on both sides of the family. My mom and my dad's side both have a lot of deaf members of the family. My brother and I both were born deaf.
I see. How did you communicate in your family?
Well, at home, to communicate with my parents, we used a lot of home signs, made up sign language. And once I went to the deaf school, I learned some ASL. And when I would come back home and communicate with my parents, I would switch between ASL and the home signs that we had used growing up. Actually, it was funny. My husband had went to Australia to sell his embroidery work, and he had met this famous man who was in Australia at the time and was trying to communicate with him through ASL, but it was very difficult. So we tried to use a little bit of those made-up gestures that we had used at my home to communicate when I was growing up, and it worked. We had an effective communication with him.
Okay. So what is your hearing level?
I'm 100% deaf. I'm totally deaf.
You're deaf. Do you identify as being a deaf person or a hard of hearing person?
Deaf. Mm-hmm.
You identify as a deaf person. Okay. So I'm sure culturally the same. You're involved in the deaf cultural community?
Yes. I do have a daughter. She can hear. And I have a son who is deaf. So I have one of each. It was very fun to raise both of them at the same time. My daughter was a nurse. She unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago.
I'm so sorry.
And then my son, Jimmy, is hard of hearing. He speaks well, and he uses cochlear implants to hear and speak. He actually works at an airport, but unfortunately was laid off a couple of years ago.
Okay. Tell me about your childhood growing up. Where did you go to school, or were you homeschooled, or where did you go to school?
I went to the Tennessee School for the Deaf. I graduated in 1964. And after school, it was very hard for me to find a job. I eventually moved to Michigan because I had a lot of relatives living in Michigan, and they had told me that there was a lot of work to be had. It was very scary for me to move to Michigan, though. There was no interstates when I was driving up to Michigan, and I'd never experienced the big cities that Michigan had, the skyscrapers and the tall buildings. And I lived in Redford Township, Michigan. I actually started to go to a Church of Christ. There was a few deaf members that went to that church. My aunt went to that church, and my aunt came with me to introduce me to a few people. I met this boy, and he asked me where I lived. I just told him I lived a couple miles down the road, and he offered to drop me off at home. I was hesitant at first, but I agreed, and he dropped me off. And when I got home, my aunt had asked me if I had met anybody at church. And I told her I met the boy, and I met a couple of their people at the church that were deaf and had a hard time reading and writing, which I thought was very interesting. But I met a lot of interesting people at the church. And the name of the town, again, was Redford Township.
What's the name of the town again?
Yes, Redford Township.
Redford Township. Oops. Redford Township. Where is that located in the state? On the eastern part of the state? The lower eastern part of the state? Very
central Michigan. When I married, we moved to Allen Park, Michigan.
Oh, I see. I'm not real familiar with the state in general, but my husband lived in Michigan at the northern part of the state.
Oh,
I know where
okay.
Detroit is on the lower eastern part of the state.
Yes, I know where that is. Yep, my husband actually worked at the Detroit newspaper. He worked there for a long time until he got laid off, and I got a little homesick, so we decided to move back to Tennessee. He then worked for a smaller newspaper in Tennessee, and then eventually decided to start an embroidering business.
Embroidery? Is that what you mean?
I started working at a woman's fabric shop, and she had a small closet that I cleaned up and made kind of my office, and worked out of that closet for a while. A lot of women would buy my work, and I would embroider their clothes for them. And it was a very good job. I started to gain a lot of customers, so much so that I had to move out. I was outgrowing the closet. So I moved my business into my house out of a bedroom, and customers would come to my house to get my embroidery work done.
Oh, wow.
And I started out working on a machine with one head. But eventually I started making hats for NASCAR.
NASCAR?
And I started making a lot of these hats, and I did not have the machinery that was capable to make all of these. So I took out a small business loan. And I was afraid that if I wasn't able to pay this loan back, I was going to lose my house. So I worked really hard to make a lot of money to pay off this loan. I bought 6 new heads for my machine to meet the demand of my business. And the 6 heads still were not enough, so I borrowed another one from a different business. And those heads cost me about $20,000. And so overall, I owed about $150,000 for my business loan and the machinery that I bought. But my business was booming, and I ended up moving into a new business. And I hired more employees to help me with all of the work. And I tended to hire a lot of deaf employees. Now the business is run mostly by people who can hear, but I tried very hard to hire people who were deaf.
How many?
And I ran the business for 22 years. My husband and I decided to move to Florida so that we could take care of our parents and weren't so far away from our family. And I hated to leave my business at that time, but I felt that's what we should do. We wanted to help out as much as we could, so we decided to move. I'm very thankful for NASCAR and a lot of country music artists, Barbara Mandrell, George Strait, Conway Twitty, a lot of old country music stars who used my services, my embroidery services, and their pictures are all hanging up on the wall of my business. They still send me Christmas gifts to thank me for my business.
So to start with, how many people worked with you when you first opened?
I started out with 2 employees.
2?
Then we moved up to 4. And once we started working on the NASCAR hats and we got more of the head machines, we had to hire more employees. So I hired some more women. Some of the employees would sew. Some of them would trim the threads. Some would count the hats and put them in the cases. We made cases of 24. So it was a very savvy business. We all had our place in the assembly line. There were a few times that we counted incorrectly and the hats would get sent back to us and we had to correct our mistake. So there came a time where I had to buy more machines to meet the demand of the business. We were meeting thousands of requests for these hats, so it was a big responsibility. And I would manage the business. I would make sure that the thread colors were right. The sewing was looking good and was straight, and it would move down the assembly line that way.
Wow, that's really cool. So,
my husband and I, we created a business called Peggy's Stitch Eraser. There was someone who had sent me a couple of their shirts that had their embroidery on it for their golf team and asked if I could fix it because the embroidery was not correct. And so, of course, I did what I could. It took me about 2 weeks of work to fix the mistake, and I sent them back to the team, and they were so appreciative of my work. And I ran that business for a while. I just sold the business last year, and the new owners of the business kept my name. It's still called Peggy Stitch Eraser, but there was a I love you symbol on the stitch eraser that they did remove eventually.
Keep your name in honor of your name, right? So they kept the name on the eraser.
But they still use my name, which I think is great. People still know who I am. I still have a great reputation in the business.
That's wonderful. So that's an accomplishment for you and your husband. You never gave up. You figured out how to solve that problem.
It was really tough. We had to fight for us to succeed. It was about 2 years of really hard work to grow our business. When we had the 6 head machines, we were making 10,000 different hats at once. And it was really hard on my hands as well.
I bet it was hard on your hands.
It was a lot of physical work. I really enjoyed the work, though. It was beautiful
It's a good experience. So now I'm curious, suppose you had a time machine. What year would you go back to? What would you do if you were in a time machine? It could be any year, 1800s or 1920s or at any time.
Well, I'm looking back, times have changed a lot. I didn't have computers or technology when I was growing up. I had to rely on my neighbors to tell me if school was going to be closed that day or to help me communicate. I didn't have a way to text or to call anyone, so I had to ask for help to communicate with my next door neighbor, and they would tell me when school was closed or open.
Good. It's nice to have neighbors that you can communicate with.
Yes, it was wonderful to have their help. We wrote back and forth for communication, and when they found out that I owned an embroidery business, they were very surprised because I was deaf. And they thought it was very interesting that I owned my own business. I read their lips every once in a while. That's how I communicated with them, or we wrote back and forth. Now, my family was very poor. We lived out in rural Cookville on a tobacco farm. We lived in a 2-bedroom house. One room was the kitchen, the other was a bedroom. My brother slept in that bedroom, and I slept on the couch. When I was about 10, we moved, and I was so excited because we finally had electricity. We did not have electricity in our old house. It was just candles and firelight.
What year was that?
I'm trying to think of the year that was. I want to say it was the 1950s. I would have to figure it out. I'm not sure the exact date. 1950s.
Before the 1950s?
Yeah.
No, when there was no electricity?
We did
You had
not
no
have any
electricity?
electricity.
Oh, wow.
Once we moved into our new house, we had electricity, but we did not have a bathroom. We still had an outhouse. And we used a potty inside at night, so we didn't have to go outside to use the restroom. My mother passed away when I was 18, which was life-changing. It was a shock. That left my dad to take care of us. And we eventually moved into a nicer home that had electricity. It had an indoor bathroom. But we did not have a shower. We
Wow.
took our baths in the river, in the creek near our house, right next to the cows grazing in the field. But honestly, it was a beautiful experience. It was always nice water. It was nice to be out in nature in that way. On Saturdays, my brother had a job washing cars, and he would also polish shoes. And I would do chores like ironing. I would collect the eggs from the chickens. My brother's job was to collect the wood for our stove. We did not have a gas stove. We used a wood-burning stove to heat our home in the wintertime. When we didn't have electricity at our old house, that's what we used. And really, it worked very well. Our house was always warm, and we never really had any problems.
Very interesting. Okay, next. What is your self-care routine? How do you take care of yourself?
Well, when my mother passed, I kind of had to learn how to fend for myself. I graduated from the deaf school, and about a year later, I started to feel very depressed. I realized that I was not feeling great. It was very hard for me to find work. So about a year after I graduated, my father and my brother and I moved up to Michigan.
Please spell that again. Oh, Michigan.
Yes, we moved to Michigan. And I was very excited for that. My aunt had a car, and so she took me to vocational rehabilitation for me to find a job. I got a job at the General Film Lab, where they made 8mm film for movies. So that's what I did. I mixed the chemicals and the different colors to make that film. And this, again, was a long time ago.
Old times.
But I was the only woman in the whole factory.
Wow.
Out of all the men. I was the only woman. Once I had my daughter, I stopped working and just became a mom. We discussed wanting to move, and then my husband was laid off from his job, and we weren't happy in Michigan anymore. We did have a lot of family in Michigan. I had a lot of siblings and relatives that worked in Michigan. But one by one, very slowly, we all started moving back to Tennessee. And we all lived near Cookeville. Well, once my mother passed, I was living near my husband's family. We were working on the idea for the stitch eraser.
Okay. My next question is, what amazing things did you accomplish as you were growing up?
I was a very skilled seamstress. I made my daughter's prom dress. And after that, a lot of her friends and their families noticed my skills and started paying me to mend their clothes and make their clothes for them as well. I then decided to drive to Ohio to buy the head machine, and start my embroidery business. Once we developed the stitch eraser, we started going to shows to display and to advertise. And usually my husband was the front man. I would just sit in the back because I didn't have an interpreter to speak with people. So my husband would do the speaking, and my husband is very skilled with languages. He knows many languages. My husband knows English, French, Italian, German. And so he would sell the stitch erasers. My husband knew a lot of languages. He could speak German to anyone who was German who would come up to our booth. And people would want to meet me and ask who Peggy is, and my husband would say, "Oh, you can meet her later." I would come out, I would say hello, kind of go back and sit down, and they would start to talk to me and then realize that I was deaf, and that was a shock for them. And of course, I didn't read lips that well, but they would always compliment my work. They said it was wonderful work, and they couldn't do their work without it. Interestingly enough, one man came up to me and told me a story about how he had met my aunt. They were in a parking lot. It was like a market where they were selling things, and my stitch eraser was being sold. And my aunt noticed and was like, "Oh, that's my niece's invention." And the man asked, "Oh, your aunt, she's deaf, right?" And they started to have a conversation about me and my story.
Right.
There was another show in Atlanta where a man had come up to us, and this man was actually Ralph Lauren.
I don't know who that is. Oh,
Ralph Lauren,
yeah.
he is the
Yes, I do.
designer, the clothes designer that has the horse logo. It's quite a shock to meet him. And he was writing back and forth with me and wanted to know if he could bring a couple of his shirts. Well, actually, it was more than a couple. It was a lot of shirts that the logo was not quite right. It was upside down, and he wanted me to know if I could fix it. And I did, and he immediately ordered 100 of the stitch erasers. He was in such shock that they worked, and he was so thankful to me. And I still have a relationship with Ralph Lauren. I still do. We still conversate. And he is always so grateful to me and thanks me for my invention. And there are a lot of other knockoffs out there, but they don't work as well as the one that I invented. They usually tend to break pretty easily, but mine has lasted a long time. And maybe eventually someone will create something that's better than mine. Who knows?
Who knows? Maybe it's your best invention. You're an inventor, a great inventor.
Yes, exactly.
Is your husband hearing or deaf? He was hard of hearing.
He's hard of hearing. He can speak.
Okay.
He did go to the Flint Deaf School. That's where he went. He also went to Gallaudet College.
Wow.
Or Gallaudet University.
When he graduated.
He actually graduated high school when he was 15. And schooling was really easy for him. He was actually quite a party boy, if you can believe it. He had broken up with his girlfriend, and we had started going out to some deaf events. We went to deaf bowling night and met up with a lot of our deaf friends. And this bowling alley had about 100 lanes. So remember the first time that we met at church, and he had brought me home. We had started going to different deaf events, meeting up with some of our deaf friends. And we had met up at the Detroit Deaf Club, DAD. It was very enjoyable. Anyway.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so what challenges did you overcome in life? You mentioned trying to figure out, I remember now, you mentioned something you had several different challenges or limitations, like talking about an 8-head machine.
We had the 6-head machines, and then
a 6-head
12,
changing to an 8-head machine
14.
to a 4-head machine. You had to overcome the challenges of the machine.
Yes, it was a challenge trying to figure out how to keep up with the demand of the business. We eventually had 24 heads on the machine.
Wow.
And we paid it off. We paid off that machine in 2 years from
great.
all of our work. It was a lot of work. I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, every morning, eat my breakfast, go into work, and manage the business, make sure everything was running properly. I would make sure all of the stitches were correct, the colors were going in the right places. Our business was open from 8 to 4 every day.
8 to 4? Is that
yes, that was our
when
business
the business
hours.
was
I'm sorry,
open?
no,
Is that what you
it was
mean?
8
The business
to 5.
hours right in the morning
8
to 4?
5.
8 to
And
5
we had
were your
1
business
hour
hours.
lunch. But we did not all take our lunch at the same time. We split into groups, so half of us would take a half an hour lunch while the other half kept working, and then we would switch. But it worked out.
You went back and forth, took turns. That's great. Okay. And the last question is, what last words would you like to share with our audience?
Well, I want to thank everyone for the support of my business over the years.
What do you have any words of wisdom that you would like to share with people today? Maybe there's some youth who are watching.
And to not rely on government subsidies for money, just work hard. And that will help you lead a happy life.
So was it easy for you to get your own business loan? SAB? What does that mean? Small S B Business Association.
Yes,
So
if
you
you want to
went
start
there?
your own
Yeah, it was-
business, what you can
Sorry,
do is
very
go to the
important to go there.
SBA and they will help you get everything in order to start a business. They'll help make your business a reality.
That's wonderful. Thank you for speaking with me. I really enjoyed learning from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.